In the last several months of quarantine, I've grown increasingly fascinated by looking back at the last 2 decades and trying to put together a story of how we got here, culturally and politically. And within all these ruminations, a particular time period stands out, that between 2002 and 2012. This is a period that people have difficulty both characterizing and also naming. Usually people refer to it as the 2000s or the oddies, neither of which sound very good, and it marks a type of cultural limbo for the West. Eventually, I plan to make a more extensive video about this period, trying to capture what happened and the main cultural events. But for the time being, I want to examine one particular cultural artifact that I definitely associate with this period: the internet musical Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog. Like most pieces of culture that come from this period of time, Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog is difficult to describe, and also difficult to imagine being made at any other period of American history. Created by geek cultural phenomenon Joss Whedon, a director who would go on to greater fame in his relationship to mainstream Avengers movies, Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog existed in a strange space in between the mainstream media production and internet media production. Starring not too popular at the time Hollywood actors like Neil Patrick Harris and Nathan Fillion, the 3-part movie was distributed first entirely on the internet and starred as another lead, Felicia Day, an actress which at that time was only known by her starring roles in internet dramas such as The Guild. Altogether, it was a weird combination. But the story of Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog, told in musical form of course, was much less strange. Summarizing the plot briefly, Dr. Horrible is a lonely, isolated, aspiring supervillain and mad scientist. The protagonist, played by Harris, pines for two things: a recognition of his infamy and skill as a scientist, represented in admission to the League of Supervillains, and secondly, an end to his isolation, which he seeks in his unrequited crush on a local activist named Penny, played by Felicia Day. Dr. Horrible's ambitions in both regards are consistently foiled by the appearance of Captain Hammer, played by Nathan Fillion, a jock-like superhero who simultaneously foils Dr. Horrible's evil plots and also, most disastrously of all, wins the affections of Penny. Captain Hammer, after all, seems to represent everything that the audience or a woman would want. A muscular, good-looking hero who always is confident and always is in the right. Consequently, he is everything that the nerd like Dr. Horrible despises and thinks is wrong with society. And as such, a classic rivalry unfolds, with Dr. Horrible planning his revenge on Captain Hammer, only to have his scheme backfire and accidentally murder Penny, the woman he loved. As the musical concludes in its final number, Dr. Horrible is admitted into the League of Supervillains, but seems to have lost his animating innocence that the audience found so endearing at the beginning of the movie. As the fan-made epitaph says, Dr. Horrible got everything he ever wanted, and all it cost him was a penny. In summary, Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog is nothing unusual. Outside of its somewhat novel for the time distribution method, its inclusion of little-known actors, and its hipsterish musical numbers, there really is nothing that's particularly groundbreaking about the plot, or even how it's presented. The story of a love triangle where a talented outcast competes against a more standard but overconfident and somewhat douchey hero for the hand of a lady is a story that goes back to the beginning of human history. It's also a story that's been particularly popular in Western literature, finding many retellings in the last 300 years, from Cyrano de Bergerac to Phantom of the Opera to Roxanne. Yet for some reason, when Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog premiered in 2008, my generation in particular, found this old-as-dirt romantic trope to be edgy and new, and breaking with all of the norms. Part of this, I think, was just good timing. Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog came out in 2008, right at the apex of the late 2000 nerd and geek culture phenomenon, a time when a lot of people who felt they had overlooked personalities believed themselves collectively to be in a mode of ascendancy. And Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog checked all the right boxes. especially for the people who considered themselves drama nerds in high school. An indie film with a non-conventional distribution method, packed full with quotable lines and inside references. Really, it fit right in with that rapidly mainstreaming subculture, portraying the titular character as a type of proto-nerd, a contrast to Captain Hammer's jock. And, because narrative ambiguity was still a thing people could tolerate in the late 2000s, the movie ultimately left it open to interpretation what we were to make of Dr. Horrible. Was he ultimately a villain and a creep, or just a misunderstood hopeless romantic? Again, this type of ambiguity existed in all of the trope's previous incarnations, but it seemed edgy and new at the time. Moreover, because of the movie's indie feel, it did feel like an underdog project, and therefore had revolutionary undertones, which were just the kind of thing that the fanbase's mostly progressive politics liked. Really, no more deep questions needed to be asked about Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog. It was just a good time. I myself wasn't really the audience for this particular movie, but I did enjoy watching it evolve as we moved from 2008 to 2011 to 2013, 14, 15, and 16. As the left-wing, progressive, and almost mainstream geek culture became more ideologically strident and more explicitly progressive, new attitudes needed to be developed to all previous media. It wasn't enough that a movie retold an old story in a new, more indie way. Now people were asking, what are the politics of Dr. Horrible? And is it on the right or the wrong side of feminism? These turned out to be more difficult questions than one might imagine. By the time 2016 rolled around, the feminist side of the culture war was well on its way to dismissing all old media that used the competitive courtship trope, from Beauty and the Beast to Phantom of the Opera, as regressive and patriarchal. After all, wasn't this the classic misogynistic woman as reward trope? These stories worked fine for a patriarchal time, but now we're woke enough to see the misogyny endemic in this narrative, and we can do better. Indeed, this dismissal did work quite well for older media, but something never quite seemed to fit about Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog. Once more, it was the same problematic, competitive love triangle trope, where two men competed in competence to win the hand of one woman. But Dr. Horrible could not so easily be dismissed as quaint. It was a movie from this generation, written and directed by people who claimed to be feminists, who should have known better. Were they trying to be misogynists? Were they trying to advocate for the patriarchy? For a while, looking at my progressive friends who liked this movie, but wanted to reconcile it with their now more radical feminist politics was interesting. It was like looking at some radical Christian convert from paganism, trying desperately to put a Christian spin on the ancient folk tales of his ancestors. Yet, in this case, unlike the analogy, synthesis seemed impossible. In the last 10 years, I've probably seen just shy of half a dozen progressive criticisms and reinterpretations of Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog. Yet, no matter how they rearrange our perceptions of who's the good guy or who's the bad guy, no matter how they reimagine the story being told from a different character's perception, or claim that everything could be fixed if just more time was spent on developing the personality of this alternative character or that. No criticism or reimagining really succeeds in rebuilding Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog as a feminist narrative without totally destroying the truth of the original trope it is based on. And recently, it occurred to me that there is a deep connection between progressives' issue interpreting Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog and their deep discomfort at dealing with and confronting male incel culture post the culmination of the sexual revolution. And to this point, I think more insight can be gained on both of these issues by looking a little bit deeper into the leftist criticism of Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog. First, just to emphasize once more, the issue with these criticisms is not that the left finds Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog problematic. The left finds everything problematic. The issue is that the left cannot come up with a set of coherent critiques that preserves what they like while at the same time criticizing what they don't. A kind of I want to have my cake and eat it too problem that's very similar to the issues that plague the left's own handling of the incel problem, and indeed all issues of modern masculinity. To start our analysis, I'm going to begin with the criticisms of Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog as outlined by Sarah Z in Innuendo Studios. The two critiques are both very recent and very similar, so much so that I can't largely distinguish which argument originated with which author. But at any rate, I think they capture the general sentiment, in hindsight, most leftists and most feminists have towards this particular piece of media. The criticisms generally focus on two political conflicts that could be rightly said to be going on inside Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog. The first, most classical and probably most obvious, is the political conflict between Captain Hammer and Dr. Horrible concerning the affections of Penny. This is the classic competitive, courtly love triangle that feminists love to hate so much. But this, in turn, is buttressed by a different power dynamic, a different story of power that obviously comes from the comparison of Dr. Horrible and Captain Hammer. Unlike some more classic tellings of the tale, Dr. Horrible and Captain Hammer aren't just from two different but symmetrical sides, Team Red and Team Blue. There's a power dynamic there. Specifically, there is a class, privilege, and competency power dynamic. As Innuendo Studios puts it, in the classic contest between hero and villain, a hero is someone who has power thrust on him that he never asked for, whereas a villain is someone who has less power than he thinks he needs in order to pursue some change he wants, and he is constantly seeking more. As Innuendo Studios points out, this essentially maps the villain role to the nerd, and the hero role to the jock. Taking it one step further, however, we also might point out this maps the villain role to the proletariat revolutionary, and the hero role to the self-satisfied bourgeoisie. In this sense, any good leftist can see an inverted narrative he wholeheartedly approves. The protagonist, the villain, Dr. Horrible, is the stand-in for the downtrodden, the proletariat. He has abilities that are unacknowledged by society. He has needs that are unmet. While all eyes of the mainstream are focused on the supposed superhero, Captain Hammer, who really only fixes things by restoring the status quo, e.g., saving people and stopping crime, Dr. Horrible wants deeper and more radical change. He wants to take over the world. He wants to have anarchy he can control. The kind of ways he wants to save people are political and revolutionary. They're sweeping and break all conventions of the status quo. And this would be very much par for any approved leftist media if it wasn't for this narrative's coexistence with the other political dynamic going on in the movie. The very classic, but very anti-feminist, competitive love triangle. As those people know who have any exposure to feminist criticism in the 20th century, the competitive love triangle, where two men compete for the hand of a single woman, has been the center for a lot of feminist disapprobation. Although if we look at the situation through the lens of classical economics, where the woman, being the in-demand party, would seem to be the person in power in this relationship, the competitive love triangle as depicted in classic romantic fiction has been considered to be an element of patriarchy. After all, most feminists would likely point out, in this dynamic, the woman really isn't a subject. She's an object for which the men, subjects, compete to obtain. In this process, she is dehumanized, treated as secondary, made into an element of the background, even within her own story. The situation is made worse by the fact that the two contestants are not usually characterized by her preference for them, but rather by some external quality. They represent good or evil, honesty or dishonesty. Maybe each of the two parties represents a different nation, or even potentially a different ideology or class. At any rate, the woman's actual preference, her actual choice is secondary. The contest itself will show us who is right, and the female's applied affection at the end is more or less just a cherry on top, a confirmation of the righteousness we just witnessed. The woman in this story has no agency. Now, all of this theory is pretty classic when it comes to feminist criticisms of old-fashioned tropes. It's been around at least since the 70s, and we've all been hearing it since the late 90s in popular culture. The creators of Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog, all being avowed feminists, certainly knew this, and they certainly tried to incorporate some of these criticisms into the narrative of the movie they produced. But here, of course, is where things get complicated. The director and producers of Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog would no doubt point to the fact that they intended to critique this trope by showing ultimately how the contest between the two men destroyed the object of their desires, Penny. Here, the classic tragical dimension of the competition seeks to outline how this trope is indeed problematic, mirroring implicitly, of course, if not explicitly, the critiques of the feminist. This type of subtle nod in the direction of the feminist critique probably would be good enough for feminists in the 90s. It certainly was not good enough for feminists post-2012. While the movie critiqued elements of the trope, it really did more to underline its initial force. All of the elements are still there. The woman is not the subject, she is the object. Moreover, in contravention of the feminists' focus, narratively at least, on the woman's choice, Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog makes us sympathize with the protagonist, the man who wasn't chosen, as he ignores his female love interest's stated desire to be with somebody else, and even tries to undo her choice. Sure, it ends tragically, but the whole narrative is there to get us to sympathize with somebody who's abusing his power, who's using his role as a privileged white male to erase the choice and desires of the other. While certain sentiments are correct, the portrayal and its relationship to the central feminist power dynamic are all wrong. Okay, so fair enough. On this criticism, it's easy to see what's wrong or problematic with Dr. Horrible. It's also easy to see how one might fix it. The problem is that our sympathies are being manipulated to go in the wrong direction. In fact, Dr. Horrible is the villain. He's the evil white male standing in the way of Penny's happiness and Penny's choice. This would be a simple criticism and a simple fix if it didn't run directly contra the narrative of the other political power dynamic playing out in Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog. The class, hierarchy, and privilege dynamic that already exists between Dr. Horrible, the proletariat, and Captain Hammer, the bourgeoisie. Here, in the left-wing, classist, and privilege-oriented language, the decision between Captain Hammer and Dr. Horrible is not an arbitrary one. Dr. Horrible stands for revolution. Captain Hammer stands for the status quo. Dr. Horrible stands for the downtrodden. Captain Hammer stands for those who are in power. Dr. Horrible stands for the oppressed and the disadvantaged, and Captain Hammer stands for privilege. And if there are any two things that the left has been very clear about in the last 2 decades, it is that 1, these sides are not equal. The proletariat and the downtrodden should always be preferred, and 2, that we cannot simply excuse the existence of hierarchies, the existence of privilege, and the preference for the privileged as a function of pure individualistic choice. Individualism and individualistic choice obscures the power dynamics and makes us not realize what's really going on. And so in the competitive love triangle, a distinct conflict emerges between the feminist narrative and the classically leftist one. And it is this conflict that is directly or indirectly dealt with from all subsequent leftist criticism of this movie, whether it comes from Sarah Z or Innuendo Studios. Everyone seems to be of one mind that Captain Hammer is bad. He represents what they don't like, the patriarchy, the status quo, privilege. But then, how can we possibly pour so much scorn on Dr. Horrible, who seems to see all of these flaws so clearly? In the method of both Sarah Z and Innuendo Studios, the way has been to push focus back into the love triangle's third corner, namely Penny. Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog would have been fixed if only the narrative had spent more time and focus on the character of Penny, on her choice, on her issues. She is the real oppressed person after all. She is the one who is fending off the affections of these two supermen. Who says she even wants them? Their attention is nothing that did anything to help her, ever, and in the end, the rivalry ends up killing her. Indeed, I've noticed most feminist criticism taking something akin to this tract. Fans reimagining the ending, where Penny wakes up unharmed by the death beam, and subsequently destroys both of her male suitors, for being so unworthy of her. The general narrative goes that not only was Penny the real victim, she was also the real hero. Who says Dr. Horrible or Captain Hammer were even up to her snuff? What gave them the right to imagine they could date her? This is what's really wrong with the competitive love triangle. The men aren't worthy of the woman they're competing over. But again, it's hard to justify this narratively within the bounds of the world that's already been created. Captain Hammer is a true blue superhero who can move trucks with his hands. Dr. Horrible is a genius on the verge of taking over the world and inventing cool laser beams that can do things. Penny, by contrast, is more or less your ordinary girl next door, a somewhat pretty but boring urbanite who has a meaningless petition and some very pedestrian ambitions. She hardly seems the equivalent of the godlike superheroes who are fighting over her, and this is not simply the function of one movie, it's genre convention. The competitive love triangle usually features very ordinary women being fought over by champions and men who are able to accomplish feats. This is a media trope, after all, that sells predominantly to women, and it needs this element to appeal to them. So it's not hard to see why this element of the trope is repeated, even in media like Twilight that's written by women for women, for the most part. Now, certainly I'm not saying that Joss Whedon couldn't have created a musical comedy where a bright, beautiful urbanite is pursued by two jobless, ugly, and overweight nerds. It sounds interesting, and it certainly would be funny, but this is not the story that they told in Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog. Usually in light of facts like this, feminist critics retreat to a second contention. It's all about choice. It's all about Penny's decision on who she wants to be with. Sure, we have to be on Dr. Horrible's side. He is, after all, the representative of the downtrodden and the proletariat. But really, what Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog demonstrates is a distinct character flaw inside Dr. Horrible himself, and how he chooses to pursue Penny's approval. Instead of lurking in the shadows and pursuing political ambitions to rule the world and change society, Dr. Horrible should have worked on himself, made himself more presentable, been more outgoing to Penny when he met her. Those larger goals about upsetting the status quo, that was just romantic hogwash that was never going to happen. If he had just been himself and cleaned his room, Penny would have liked him. After all, as Innuendo Studios puts it, Captain Hammer is such a douchebag, and his relationship with Penny is so transparently shallow that it's never going to last for long. Ultimately, Penny's choice to be with Hammer doesn't mean anything, and Dr. Horrible should just be patient. Wait for the whole thing to collapse. And then Penny's eyes will open and she'll be able to see the real quality of what Dr. Horrible has to offer her. I have personally found these two criticisms coming from Innuendo Studios to be particularly funny, as they seem to directly contradict either the core tenets of leftism or the core tenets of common sense. The clean your room and be yourself advice is none other than that given by Dr. Jordan Peterson. Same advice that was certainly not well received by the political left, who considered it a distinct distraction away from efforts to change larger elements of structural inequality. The second piece of advice Innuendo Studios has for Dr. Horrible is even worse. One could argue that men who fight with each other over the affections of a single woman are pathetic and short-sighted. But the only thing more pathetic than this is orbiting around a relationship that's already going on, hoping that it falls apart so that you can swoop in. In other words, this is terrible relationship advice. And as for all the hot air about Penny's choice not being the correct one, and how it could be remade, in the context of the plot, this is meaningless. Where Penny's character as a subject might be somewhat downstaged by the other two figures in the triangle, she does have a choice. And she did make it. She chose Captain Hammer. She chose the bourgeoisie and the privileged. And she chose against the revolution and the proletariat. In other words, Penny's choice is counter-revolutionary. In these reactions, I think we see a very comedic inability to perceive what's actually going on. When the leftist tries to make the feminist narrative real, he inevitably minimizes the proletariat and privilege dynamic. When he tries to make the privilege dynamic and class dynamic real, he inevitably minimizes the feminist one. This is what computer scientists sometimes call the pillow principle. One side always goes up. There has to be a trade-off. But it's not something that the left, for political reasons, can even understand is happening. And it reminds me very much of their attitude and attempt to understand the concept of incels. Now, of course, if this video had come out a year or two ago, I probably would have to explain thoroughly what incels are. In short, I can just say here that they are the very sizable number of men who cannot seem to attract women under any circumstances, and subsequently have come to self-identify with the label of incel, or involuntarily celibate. As one might expect, these individuals tend to share in a very depressive and downward disposition. They see themselves as the great losers of our present social order, and they're not entirely wrong about this. As we are now just beginning to see through measurement and statistics, the culmination of the sexual revolution has led an increasing number of young men who have just never had any relationships. And while part of this might be cultural, and part of it might be political or economic, not all of this trend can be attributed to bad personal decisions on the part of those who find themselves in the incel category. Something about our society now is structurally different. Something about our society is structurally not equal. And of course, this is where the left's problem begins. When it comes to our institutions, be they societal, economic, or cultural, the incel is most certainly the loser. He is most certainly the man on the bottom of the hierarchy. He has low social status, he usually has low amounts of liquid capital, and low career prospects. And very infrequently, the incel feels that he has nothing to lose. The telltale sign of someone who's on the bottom rung of a social organization. Under classical left-wing class theory, therefore, we would immediately recognize the incel as the lower class, as the proletariat, as the subject in the left's heroic narrative, and as the object of the left's moral concern. You'd predict this, understanding classical leftist theory and understanding the facts on the ground. But of course, this prediction would be totally wrong. Far from being perceived as a client class to the left, the incel has instead become a villain, a manifestation of everything the left-wing coalition hates and wants to fight against. He might be the downtrodden and the loser in society's great game, but he still is the enemy, because he has any number of bad qualities: toxic masculinity, bitterness, white privilege, pure, unadulterated evil. I don't know. Give the left more time and they'll probably come up with more pejoratives to hurl at the incel. But at any rate, he is not welcome in their coalition of the oppressed, regardless of how little he has in this world. Ultimately, though, for those who look into it, I think very few of these excuses pan out. The left rarely cares about violent tendencies and toxicity when it comes to other client groups it gladly embraces. And as for the frequent complaint that incels incorrectly ally with the right wing, this is more or less because the left wouldn't have them. Their complaints were already treated as illegitimate before the concept of their community formed properly on the internet. And for a more cynical observer of the situation, it's not hard to see why a post-intersectionality left would find itself in this position. Young, unmarried women in North America and Europe are, for now, a strong coalition member in the left. Moreover, as we've always known traditionally, and as we are beginning to measure now statistically, women who are young and unmarried always seek mates who are stronger, smarter, and better economically situated than themselves. And while this order was somewhat fulfillable in an age of high sexual dimorphism and the family wage, in our current age of egalitarianism, it's somewhat hard to come by. Yet, despite ideology, the preference of young women is unshakable. And, despite the left's pretense to critique and deconstruct all notions of power and privilege, No radical theorist is ever going to tell a young woman that she has to set her sights lower and look for men who are below average. That would break the leftist coalition and leftist narrative in two. And as such, in the incel problem, we see the same contradiction and the same narrative interpretation problem as we see in Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog. The revolution against privilege, the revolution for equality, keeps on going and going and going until it suddenly doesn't, until it suddenly has to stop. Its own logic has ceased to apply. Its own narrative no longer makes sense, and a new narrative needs to begin. At this point, almost every leftist breadtuber has tried to take on the incel problem, and none of their solutions ever really seem to make sense. It always clashes on these narrative rocks, on the core contradiction between feminism and privilege. Once any thinker comes to any sort of conclusion that won't get them cancelled, they will inevitably have to admit that at some level, the logic of the revolution has its limits. The narratives cannot properly be juxtaposed and synthesized. Now, it's been a while since I've had any extended talk with a major leftist on this particular topic, but I wouldn't be surprised if many of them, at this stage, even recognize the conflict and contradiction that's present here. But the problem from my vantage point is much more than just a conflict or contradiction. It's that this conflict exposes each narrative as a bald-faced lie about how we've chosen to organize human mating dynamics and what's gone wrong with them in the contemporary world. As a thinker who identifies himself as right-wing, who wants to more thoroughly mainstream certain reactionary concepts inside right-wing circles, I find myself doing a lot of outreach to people who consider themselves unaffiliated. Thinkers and seekers who feel alienated both from the left and the right. Most of these individuals are men, most too find themselves in frustrating life situations, and also identify with one of the many labels, usually applied to men who focus their political efforts on the issues that tend to frustrate young men in our contemporary society. MRAs, MGTOWs, and even the occasional person who identifies as an incel. Oddly enough, when I talk to them, a certain dynamic tends to emerge. In so many words, these individuals ask me, what does the right wing, what does neo-reaction have to offer men? Men who have ended up on the bottom of society, men who are considered the losers, men who felt that their society promised them something, and then never delivered. Often I don't know how to answer this question, but it certainly would begin with a caveat. The same caveat that Morpheus gave Neo right before handing him the red pill. All we have here to offer on the right is the truth, and nothing more. But in the truth, I think there is clarity, and a chance at least to stop chasing our tails and actually work on the problem involved. But that being said, what is the truth that a reactionary or realist perspective will shed on the subject of privilege, incels, and the human mating dynamic? Perhaps we can start with this. Human mating dynamics, at least insofar as they concern females' attraction to men, is centrally organized around one metric, and that metric is status. Now, while status might be conferred for any number of reasons, and may be seen as somewhat a composite of a variety of other qualities, such as wealth, competence, ability, social skills, or moral aptitude, the metric of status, however, differs in one key regard. It is zero-sum, and it is strictly hierarchical. This means if you have more status, someone else necessarily has less. It also means that in no ways can we equalize status. Based on how human societies are always set up, based on how we're inclined to set them up, there always will be a bigger fish. The grass will always be greener on someone's side for sure. And here we see how status is so different from the other things that humans might pursue in their lives. While we can imagine a general increase in societal wealth, as we have obviously witnessed since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, there can be no societal increase in status. All men might have a comfort and living standard equivalent of some noble from the Middle Ages, but that does not make every man a champion or a king. Moreover, a general increase in competence or ability doesn't really have any impact on status. just like in a foot race determining who is the champion or gold medal winner. It doesn't matter whether you're competing on a high school, collegiate, or even Olympian scale. At the end of the day, there will be one winner, one second place, and one last place. That's just how zero-sum hierarchies work. And this reality can be very depressing for young men, especially when we combine it with an insight that everyone intuitively knew before 1965, and for which we are now getting empirical confirmation upon studying how online dating markets work. And this insight is the well-known fact that women prefer men of higher status. And while they can be somewhat flexible in how far up the hierarchy they choose, they almost always want higher status men than themselves. This is a consistently frustrating fact for those progressives who seek an egalitarian solution to the problems that now beset our post-sexual revolution reality. This is one of the major flies in the ointment of those who seek sexual and gender equality. And for this reason, I don't think it's surprising that many progressives attempt to deny this readily observable fact. Usually I think they try to accomplish this by moving the goalposts and restructuring the question. The issue is not that women prefer higher status men, the issue is that men aren't good enough. Men aren't bringing enough to the table for women. They aren't good at the right kinds of things. They're not presentable enough. These are the excuses usually given by feminists, but they don't seem to hold up to much empirical examination. 75% of men can't be below average under any normal behavior of a population. Furthermore, while we might imagine some golden standard that men used to live up to but currently don't, and assuredly degeneration is a thing, all available evidence we have points to the fact that women are degenerating just like men are, and this really does not complement the feminist idea of equal worth. I imagine coming in contact with this hard reality is a key driver leading many young men away from the left and towards the right, or at least towards some other anti-progressive cause. Issues like the ones I'm describing here are commonly described and discussed in the manosphere under titles like female hypergamy and gynocentrism. And it's not uncommon for young men first trying to find answers to these issues to eventually find their way to a genuinely right-wing ideology. But those men, armed with these concepts, usually are quite surprised when they talk to reactionaries like me, because complaining about female hypergamy and gynocentrism doesn't get you very far on the right wing. And this is because it's obvious, for anyone who looks at the human race at a historical scale, that women's preference for higher status men is natural, good, and completely morally necessary. At least if we want this thing called the human race to survive and not degenerate into moral oblivion. Once more, as most reactionaries or traditionalists would understand, collective survival is more important than individual happiness, even the statistical happiness of an entire large group of people. And this is where we have to be honest about what's going on. Women are the guardians of the next generation. Their choice is the softer side of how this species resolves Darwinian pressure, the harder side obviously being death and violence. In this role, women are rightly equipped with an instinct to always seek what is better in men, to always choose men who feel like they're bringing society forward in a good direction, to choose mates that look like they have a high probability of bringing forth a next generation that's uplifted. In other words, women need to desire men who are better. They need to pressure men to be better, both before and after they are in a relationship with them, and when they are choosing mates, they need to pick men who aren't bad, who aren't weak, who aren't evil. This is not simply women's prerogative, it is their sacred duty to the continuation of the species. Women want to make men better, and they want to find men who are better. And within all the confusion of trying to evaluate whether people are good or not, what is the most simple and basic standard any individual has available to herself? Well, that's easy. The easiest and most available standard of status and morality is the standard to which you hold yourself. The standard that you see staring back at you in the mirror. As such, female quote-unquote hypergamy is born necessarily. If we were to wave a magic wand and instantly remove females' hypergamous instinct to desire status, if we were to collectively magically replace this preference in mates for, say, the preference in mates exhibited by a 13-year-old boy, e.g., first come, first served, instantly, civilization would enter a cultural and generational death spiral. Low time preference behavior, at least in men, would go completely out of the window. There would be a constant drive to be flashy and be first, rather than to carefully cultivate a personality and a set of achievements. And every type of lazy, immoral behavior would be privileged, by virtue that, if nothing else, they have the same chance of getting a mate than those who worked hard and tried to do something impressive. And if civilization was not immediately destroyed by this initial perverse incentive, it certainly would be degraded in coming generations, as these lack of preferences moved into cultural fixtures and eventually into genetic ones. In other words, the removal of female hypergamous desire for high-status men would take the degeneration this society is already experiencing and kick it into overdrive. This is the necessary and natural reality of human mating relationships. And it does, in some sense, suck. The existence of this fact, of females' preference for higher-status men, means that necessarily they'll be losers in the mating game, and these losers will be mostly men. And unfortunately, the only answer any responsible society will have to these men's plight, however much it is a simple statistical necessity in the system we've constructed, is the answer that the left wing hates so much. The Jordan Peterson answer. Clean your room, improve yourself, ante up and try again. Man, it's irritating to hear, but that's just how the game is played. And hey, before I go on, let's not be too pessimistic. The female preference for men of higher status can be resolved in a way that looks like this, with most women desiring only a few men. But it can also be resolved in a way that looks like this, with only a few losers. And society, Christian society at least, used to be organized like this. Furthermore, we can be merciful. We can encourage men to try again. And statistically, at the end of the day, the only real losers will be the ones who don't want to try again and again. But as palatable as this scenario is, I can already hear objections. Sure, people will say, this type of be better than average and always keep trying mentality worked for a time. It was well suited for a society in the past, a society where the average man could win, and a society where the slightly above average man was attractive to the average woman. But is that the society we currently live in? Is that the direction where we're moving? Every year in this environment of Tinder and social stratification, we seem to be moving further and further away from this ideal. Well, all of this is true, but it points directly to the problems of the sexual revolution and the progressive movement that drove that sexual revolution and still seeks to continue its legacy. It goes directly to the heart of the left's issue and inability to really address the problem of the incel. In classical leftist or communist theory, society is constructed of a number of material and social hierarchies. The goal of progress, subsequently, is to flatten those hierarchies, using, of course, the people who are located at the bottom to drive political and social change. But of course, though, there is a problem when we get to status hierarchies. Status hierarchies are zero-sum by definition. They are relative and oftentimes non-material, and as such, you can't really flatten them without destroying them. Sure, you can invert them, you can rearrange them, but at the end of the day, you still have a status hierarchy, just one that's differently arranged. And while oftentimes the left does talk about turning the status hierarchies upside down, it doesn't really solve the core problem. There always is the assumption that those put in high positions on a status hierarchy will become worthy of their position, but this simply serves to reconstruct the old dynamics, just with different leaders at the top. As they say, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. And if ever there was a genuine inversion of a hierarchy where less competent people got seen as the top dogs, this would simply massively build up instability in any political system by concentrating highly competent people at the bottom of how you allocate power. This might be beneficial for some political organizations temporarily, but in the long run, this is a recipe for civil war and chaos. Most idealistic leftist projects run aground on this principle, if on nothing else. Humans, more than anything else, care about social status hierarchy, as can be seen very readily from the social status hierarchy playing out in the human dating and mating game. And the left's never really had a very good solution for this problem. The message that the left usually tells to young, down-on-their-luck men is, join us, you're low status, and through effort, through collective action, through political change, we can make you high status. In fact, we'll make everyone high status. Most young men targeted with this propaganda, having little to lose, don't look at the fine print or think too hard about how this will actually work in reality. After all, if the social order changes, they can only gain, right? But what happens when this core leftist principle and core leftist political mechanism hits a real political fixture, like that of women's natural preference for higher status men? Well, the answer has been consistent since the beginning of these left-wing revolutionary movements. The contradiction is covered up with lies. And because of those lies, the problem only grows, which is not necessarily bad for leftist political victories. As we've seen many times before, leftist political movements have a preternatural ability to exacerbate the problems their movements seek to alleviate. Their client class is constituted of people who have those chronic problems. And if those problems statistically grow, well, that simply means more clients. More people who feel like the system screwed them over and really want revolution. And this can be seen naturally in the one revolution the left actually completed in the 20th century, the sexual revolution. Initially, if you were a low-status man in the 1950s, the sexual revolution was all upside. It meant early and premarital sexual experiences that in the past time would have only been achievable by the very highest status men. And it seemed like no cost either if you were a mid-status woman. A little looseness early in life wouldn't matter, especially if you could count on marriage later. But eventually, as for all things based on lies, the bill would eventually come due. The post-sexual revolution West is now giving birth to generations that not only have lower marriage rates, but that also have fewer overall romantic and sexual relationships. They have a greater number of men who never even had a relationship. As does always happen, the revolution eats its children, starting with those on the bottom. It's in this light that I always feel worried looking at the modern iteration of the left, and the modern upswing of radical politics on the left, especially when it comes to angry young men. Ultimately, the left as it stands has nothing to give to those who describe themselves as incels, but it will take them, rename them, and retrofit their anger to work inside a revolutionary coalition. The grievances of a sexless young man might not be something that the left wants to entertain. It might be something that the left considers regressive or reactionary. But the same grievances coming from a non-binary man or a trans lesbian, those seem like they could be revolutionary. That has political potential. Though, when I see these attitudes emerge in the younger generation, I can't help but thinking back to my own cohort and our inability to truly understand the very simple story encased in Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog. Looking back on the musical, I expected to have ambiguous feelings about the meaning and possible correct interpretation, but I found that this was less the case. Ultimately, I think it's very clear that Dr. Horrible is more or less the villain. And despite the fact that the narrative goes to great lengths to make Captain Hammer look like an asshole, it is undoubtable that the protagonist of the story is a creep. And it's very telling that his own actions lead to the death of the woman he loves. In short, the feminist interpretation of this media is probably much more accurate and much more healthy than the class privilege analysis of the media. And this in many ways carries over to our reaction to incels. I know a lot of orthodox leftists who notice the contradictions I've been pointing to here probably think that the left's attitude towards incels and the other men who lose in the modern dating marketplace is a bit of leftist hypocrisy, a necessary political concession to cynical feminist demands. If we were principled, they might say, we would want to upset and flatten all unjustified hierarchies. All this, I think, is more or less ideological window dressing around the fact that the female desire for high-status mates is natural and necessary for human society, whereas the weird leftist obsession with creating a situation of equality between all participants in a society is simply delusional and destructive. Returning to Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog, my chief frustration with the protagonist is that no one informs him about how misguided he is. You don't become a supervillain and lobby for political change because you want to get a girlfriend. And while this seems like cute Jordan Peterson type advice, for most things that we want in our own lives, we have to look towards our own resources and our own ability to obtain them. Reform is necessary, but in some ways it has to become secondary, at least in personal affairs. And to do otherwise is to court disaster, of the kind that Dr. Horrible eventually brought on himself and on Penny. But while the people who are behind Dr. Horrible's state of cluelessness and self-deception are more or less unnamed, at least in the actual movie, the same is not the case in our own contemporary political environment. Here, the key villain is most definitively the left. It has been feeding young men a pack of lies for 40 years now, and it never seems like it is going to be held account. It doesn't seem like its own contradictions and own poor predictions will ever be recognized by the people they hurt. But does it have to be this way? The left is rightfully afraid of angry young men, but it's doing more than anything else to encourage this. It's hiding everything they ever wanted behind a vaguely described leftist political revolution. And then it's suddenly surprised that it's concocted a formula for political violence on a large scale? People look at the political and cultural left over the past 40 or 50 years and oftentimes see a deep conspiracy to concoct revolution. But I don't think that this is actually the case. The source of the left's mendacity and deception is not a desire for power, it's simply embarrassment. They were wrong about how mating dynamics would work among humans. They were wrong about our ability to flatten social hierarchies. They were wrong about almost every element of the sexual revolution. And when it comes to the victims of these mistakes, well, it's just easier to lie to them, to feed them comforting non-truths. To tell them that their princess is in another castle, and that they should keep striving for the revolution. Nothing is solved and the can is successfully kicked down the road, but eventually this is going to have to stop. The left has in fact created its own incel problem. It's created a generation of Dr. Horribles, all bent on revolution and world conquest. And this anger is eventually going to erupt. Eventually the revolution will come. And as usual, those on the bottom will suffer. But through all the destruction and the loss that's likely to come from this upheaval that really is already being set into motion, what really makes you angry is how it was all preventable. We could have just told the truth. We could have just leveled with young men about the hard reality of it all, instead of making things worse. Because at the end of the day, all of these millions of lives, dragged down into unnecessary depression, could have been saved. All of the heartache and pain could have been mitigated. All of the eventual destruction they will bring on society could have been prevented for $1's worth of honesty and a penny's worth of basic humility.